Hello, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, thank you so much for dropping by. My name is Marianne L. I cover mostly true crime. If you're not new here, lovely to see you again. As ever, welcome to my humble abode. Today's case is, it's another doozy. It's another horrific one. So today I'm covering the shocking murder of Jimmy Prout, who was a 45-year-old vulnerable man with mental health challenges. Now, this occurred in 2016 in the north of England, in the North Shields area. And basically, Jimmy fell victim to a group led by a very manipulative man called Zahid Zaman. Now, tragically, Jimmy viewed this group as his friends. But Jimmy was subjected to Zahid's cult-like control, psychological abuse, and absolutely unimaginable violence. This violence was described as Dark Ages style torture. I mean, this is how bad and horrific it was. It really was Dark Ages style torture. And this ultimately resulted in Jimmy's tragic death. Now, there is a million trigger warnings in this case. So, as ever, your mental health is paramount, and I want you to look after yourselves. And if it's not for you, if you don't want to listen to any of that, I mean, nobody wants to listen to any of that, but, you know, if you can't handle that today, please look after yourself, come back another time. I'm still going to be here. I'm glued to this seat. I mean, you know, I'm not going anywhere. So look after yourselves. So, as much as I don't want to, let's get on with the murder, the horrific torture. 153 days of frickin' hell this man went through. The murder of Jimmy Prout. So let's start with Zahid Zaman. He was the leader of this group. Not much is actually known about his background and his early life. The little that we do know, we know that in the early 2000s, he was living in Sheffield in the north of England. Now, he claimed to have been in a car accident. He said that this car accident was with a police car and it left him in a coma, and he needed to use a wheelchair, basically for the rest of his life. Now, as we will find out, Zahid is a little bit of a truth fabricator. So he's definitely, in all the pictures and everything, he's definitely going around in a wheelchair, and he definitely needs a wheelchair to some degree. But how much he needs this wheelchair is debatable. So Zahid was an avid online dater, and he would portray himself in his profiles as this wealthy, influential man. One of his pictures, it even had solid gold bars behind him, and he thought that this was some kind of way to appear more attractive to women. This was back in the 2000s, and to be fair, it was probably a little bit more impressive back then. You know, online dating was relatively new. I think Match.com, that started in the mid-90s. So, you know, it's not like today. It was a relatively newish type thing. So, you know, sitting with gold bars behind you possibly was a little bit more, I don't know, appealing. People weren't as aware of the scams that there are around now. But yeah, this is what he did anyway to make himself attractive to women. But obviously, this persona that he portrayed was an absolute lie. Zahid was a manipulator. He exploited people for both emotional and material gain. He would claim to have this amazing job, earn good money, etc., etc. But in reality, he was unemployed. The wheelchair he claimed to rely on, this was, again, a means to obtain financial benefits and basically garner sympathy from others. Now, I'm not saying he didn't need a wheelchair. I think he probably did need a wheelchair. The question is just how badly he needed this wheelchair. Now, for a lot of people, it's not like you need to be in a wheelchair 24/7. You know, you can get up and down and you know, do basic things. But in Zahid's case, he was basically seen very frequently moving freely around. And we're talking things like carrying furniture around. He was seen running after a bus. He would jump out of his wheelchair to start fights. Things like this, which just makes it questionable as to how much he needed this wheelchair. Now, over the years, Zahid perfected his skills as this manipulator, and he basically preyed on lonely, vulnerable people. And he positioned himself as a saviour-like figure. And he used charm to draw people into his inner circle by making them feel kind of dependent on him and grateful to him. And this basically allowed him to then exert control over them. Ultimately, Zahid's manipulative tactics resulted in the creation of this devoted group of followers. And this group of followers, the media would subsequently come to dub as the North Shields Death Cult. The North Shields Death Cult. Nice name, but this is the kind of group that he had. I'm not sure it exactly can be described as a cult, but there was certainly cult-like similarities to this group. I'm going to refer to it as a group because I don't think it's a cult, but it's, you can definitely see the cult-like similarities there. So over the next few years, he basically recruits more people to this cult, or to this group, cult group, whatever. They're bad people. So the next person to join this group was a woman called Kay Rayworth. Now, he actually met Kay through online dating in 2005. Kay was born on November the 10th, 1960, and she was 13 years Zahid's senior. So there was a bit of an age gap between them. She lived at number 35 St Stephen's Way in Percy, Maine. Percy, Maine was a small village which was incorporated into the town of North Shields in the north of England. Kay had been married twice before. She had 2 children from her first marriage. And before meeting Zahid, Kay was described as a happy person. She participated in community activities such as singing in her local church choir, playing cricket at her local village hall. Basically she was pretty happy, pretty outgoing, pretty standard type of person. But when Kay met Zahid online, she was drawn to this lovish profile. The gold bars obviously did it for her. But she had been struggling a little bit with her mental health. She'd had her second divorce, and basically Zahid took advantage of her vulnerable situation. She's going through this tough time, going through a divorce, whatever, you're going to be a bit depressed, and Zahid pounced on that. In fact, he pounced on it so quickly that very, very shortly after they met online, he actually moved from Sheffield, where he was, to North Shields, where Kay was, and moved into Kay's home. Now, this was a completely sudden move, and it's probable that Zahid saw Kay's property as financially beneficial to him. Basically, Kay was so taken in by him, she failed to notice his rapidly escalating campaign of physical and psychological manipulation. And in 2007, Zahid convinced her to purchase a second home. Now, this was at 75 St Stephen's Way. So her home is at 35 St Stephen's Way. This second home is at 75 St Stephen's Way. So basically, these 2 addresses are literally kind of on the same street. So this new house is just down the street from where she currently lives, and Zahid convinced her to purchase this second home. He still was exerting his kind of control over her. He was dictating things like where the furniture should go, in her own house. He flew into rages over small things. He would get up from his wheelchair, like I said, to beat her. He was seen hitting her in the head with a stick on more than one occasion. He would spit in her face. He would smash holes in the walls with a hammer. It was terrifying. It was intimidating. And basically, Zahid claimed that the reason he did all this was because he had this brain injury from the car accident and that he couldn't control his anger. That might be true. I don't know, but that's what he claimed. But he would then blame, when he did all this stuff and he got out of control and he would beat Kay, he would basically blame her. He would say it was her fault for making him angry. So she was the one that made him do it. That is coercive control right there. Now, Kay could only do things with Zahid's permission. So he wanted her to do things like convert to Islam. She wasn't allowed to see her non-Muslim friends, attend her Christian church anymore. He would isolate her from her family. He even stopped Kay from seeing her own children. This is narcissistic, controlling behaviour. He controlled every aspect of her life. And he transformed Kay from this happy social person into somebody that became isolated and alone. If she tried to leave him, he would emotionally blackmail her into staying with him, threatening to harm himself if she tried to leave. That, again, is a controlling behaviour, when you threaten to harm yourself to keep somebody with you. He even claimed to have overdosed one time and told Kay he would only get his stomach pumped if she went back to him. He even claimed to wear a bulletproof vest because there were gangsters in Sheffield after him. He told Kay that he had these gangster friends who would do his bidding. So basically he was intimidating her and forcing Kay to believe that he was this dangerous individual with dangerous gangster acquaintances. So ultimately, she was too scared to leave him. So next, we have Jimmy Prout. He was the next person to join this gang. Now, when I talk about this group of individuals and them not being very nice, I'm not including Jimmy Prout here. James Prout was affectionately known as Jimmy, and he was born in 1970 in the Scotswood area of Newcastle in the northeast of England. He was one of 8 siblings, and he had a tough upbringing. Growing up, his father was often absent, and his mother struggled with mental health issues. The family lived in one of the toughest neighbourhoods in Newcastle, where basically survival, it was a daily struggle. And this led Jimmy to turn to petty crime to support his family. He kind of followed in his brother's footsteps, I believe, a little bit. And we're talking petty crime. Crime is crime, obviously, but it was survival for them. And as a result, he was placed in a care home in Wales until he reached the age of 16. Now, according to his brother, Jimmy then became withdrawn when he left this care home. And sadly, his brother believed that he was the victim of sexual abuse. Obviously, this is speculation, but, it's a possibility. Now, despite Jimmy's learning difficulties and the fact that he struggled with things like reading and writing, he was very, very skilled with his hands and he could repair anything. He was a natural handyman. And people, neighbours, friends, they often would call on Jimmy to fix things. He was really, really liked in his community. He was described as this gentle person. Basically, very, very different from the tragic figure that he would later become. One woman called Lee McGregor, who knew Jimmy through the church, she would describe him as a lad with a heart of gold. He would fly to the moon and back just to help you. He was so kind-hearted that nothing was too good for him to do for you. This is the kind of character that Jimmy was. He was nothing like the rest of this group, and nothing like Zahid, and the way that Zahid manipulated the rest of the group to become. So in 1990, Jimmy met his partner, Mandy Carter, and they had 2 children together. Unfortunately, they encountered financial troubles, and Jimmy kind of fell back into this petty crime lifestyle. Don't forget, he's got these learning difficulties as well. And without the kind of necessary mental health support, he sadly ended up becoming homeless. By the mid to late 2000s, he became a regular user of homeless services, things like soup kitchens. And it was here, around this time, that he encountered Zahid Zaman at the People's Kitchen in Newcastle. Now, Zahid, he would frequently visit this soup kitchen under the guise of volunteering. His true intention, though, was to seek out vulnerable individuals. He basically wanted to recruit these people into his gang. So he charmed Jimmy with stories of heroism and basically manipulated Jimmy into believing that he was a good person. And Jimmy, bless him, he was a sensitive soul and he was trusting. So when Zahid offered him a place in the group, he took Zahid up on that offer, and he ended up moving into number 75, which was this other house that Zahid had convinced Kay to purchase. Basically, Zahid provided Jimmy with companionship, a sense of belonging, and basically Jimmy was completely unaware of the horrors that awaited him under Zahid's tight control. So the next person to join Zahid's group was a woman called Myra Wood. She was born on the 29th of October 1966. Myra, similar to Kay, she had gone through a divorce and connected with Zahid on Facebook in 2009. Now the two quickly hit it off. Myra did have a little bit of a criminal past. She had previous for child cruelty when she left her children at home to basically meet another man. And then in 2013, she actually went to prison for 16 weeks. And this was for stealing from an elderly man. Now, when she got out of prison in July, she had nowhere to live. And this is where Zahid stepped in and did his "I'm a lovely individual" thing, and basically invited her to join Jimmy and also move into number 75 St Stephen's Way. Now, this is a really odd situation because don't forget, Zahid is in a relationship with Kay. And so now Myra has moved in and there's this kind of romantic thing going on with them as well. But he is still living at number 35 with Kay. It's a bit strange. I don't know why these women don't seem to mind, but that's the situation. I don't know how long exactly he was in relationships with these women for. It's still a little bit unusual. But basically, Zahid soon began exhibiting exactly the same kind of controlling and manipulative behaviour towards Myra as he had done with Kay. So she worked as a cleaner and Zahid took the wages that she earned. She also became Zahid's carer because he's in this wheelchair and he needs a carer. So she was obviously getting paid for caring for him. But again, he took this carer's allowance benefit that she got. Again, another symptom of coercive control is kind of taking people's financial security away from them. When Myra's daughter Elizabeth later testified in court, she said that she would try to contact her mother but get no response. She said that she couldn't even call Zahid and Myra's partnership a relationship because it wasn't a relationship. He was controlling her. Now, the final member of this group was another woman called Anne Corbett. She was born on November the 8th, 1990. Now, Anne met Jimmy at the People's Kitchen, at this soup kitchen in Newcastle, They met around about 2013 and they later began a relationship. And this is how Anne ended up moving into number 75 with Jimmy and also with Myra, who is living there. Anne was in her 20s, so significantly younger than Jimmy and the rest of the group, actually. She was younger than all of them. She also had learning difficulties, and kind of combined with her younger age, her naivety and vulnerability made her this ideal recruit for Zahid's group. So this is all the members. We have Zahid and Kay living at number 35, and then we have Myra, Jimmy, and Anne living at number 75. And this is Zahid's group. Now, as we know, Zahid likes to initially portray himself as this nice individual in order to kind of lure people into believing he's this nice person and to basically be in a better position to manipulate them and control them. So when Zahid first moved to Percy, Maine, to number 35 with Kay, he portrayed himself as an upstanding citizen, a pillar of the community. He was actively involved in various charity events, such as volunteering at the local soup kitchen, as we know. He was even photographed with the Mayor of Newcastle and Gateshead for his charity work. He was featured in a local newspaper as a hero for finding a neighbour's missing dog. Zahid was offered a reward for finding this dog, but he refused it. He claimed that he was just happy the neighbour got their dog back and that he loved dogs. Now, later on, Zahid does something with a dog, which kind of proves that this is all crap. Again, it is this persona that he is portraying. It's all a lie, an absolute lie. The reality was that Zahid was a nuisance. He was literally the neighbour from hell. He would intentionally provoke people to elicit a reaction from them. He would make excessive noise at random hours, banging and hammering on the walls in an attempt to disturb them. He also installed CCTV cameras around his property, or properties, I should say, because he had two properties at this point. And he frequently wore a body camera. Now, he did all this not for security reasons, not for his own security, anything like that. All of this was to spy on his neighbours. He wanted to catch his neighbours doing something so that he could report them to the police or to the local council. He was constantly trying to provoke them. He was rude, he was insulting, he would pick fights, he would goad them into reacting. And then he could pounce and he could file complaints and he could report them. He would tell the police that they were being racist or discriminating against him due to his disabilities. None of this was the case. Some of the things he did are ridiculous. On one occasion, he intentionally knocked over everyone's rubbish bins down the street in his wheelchair. He caused this mess, tried to get into an argument with the neighbour who confronted him. In another instant, he confronted a neighbour who had thrown rubbish into his garden and attacked him with a snooker ball in a sock. He smashed it against his neighbour's head. Now, snooker balls, they're quite small, but dear God, they're like heavy. It's like basically like a rock. This neighbour was left with a lump on his temple and he reported the incident to the police, but no action was taken against Zahid. And actually, it was the neighbour who ended up being cautioned by the police, presumably for putting this rubbish in the garden, I'm not sure. But how insane is that, that it was the neighbour that ended up being cautioned by the police? On another occasion, Zahid asked a different neighbour to set fire to one of his other neighbour's sheds in exchange for liquid morphine. The neighbour who set the fire was caught, and again, this neighbour didn't implicate Zahid. What the hell is going on here that people aren't implicating Zahid? Another neighbour did paving work for Zahid to make it easier to get his wheelchair into the house. And this neighbour said that he would see Zahid walking around despite his claims of disability. I mean, don't forget, Zahid is claiming disability allowance. but it's a bit dubious as to how disabled Zahid actually was. I'm not sure. I don't want to accuse anybody, but it's certainly a question. When it came time for this neighbour to be paid for doing this paving work, Zahid became confrontational. He accused his neighbour of being a racist and threatened to report him to the police. And he was recording him. The neighbour never received any payment for the work he did. Basically, he was recording everything. He would wear this body cam stuff. So I think this is why everybody is scared to do anything, because Zahid was constantly recording everybody all the time. So if you do dare to answer back to him, then you could be the one that ends up in trouble. Another example of the kind of person that he was, he made a complaint in 2012 to the local council because they refused to give him more benefits. Now, when the housing manager, her name was Dawn Statham, when she responded to him in writing, Zahid basically fabricated her official letter and replaced it with a letter that he had created. It had a series of racial slurs, discriminatory language, all about him. And he reported her to the police with this fabricated letter. Now, she was subsequently interviewed by the police under caution and formally investigated. This is kind of the crazy stuff that this man does. This letter basically said, "Dear Mr. Zaman, you are a bastard, an immigrant benefit cheat claiming to be disabled. We at the council believe that you are the problem. You cause trouble and then claim to be the victim, and you are nothing but scum. We advise you to do the following options. A, move as we are not interested in helping you. B, stop moaning to the police as they've had enough. And C, accept you are a bastard and you're not disabled but an immigrant benefit cheat. In order to conclude, why don't you kill yourself and save us loads of money, since your life is that bad due to alleged hate crimes? Yours sincerely, Dawn Statham." Now, obviously, this letter was determined to be a forgery. To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure why they took it seriously in the first place. It is so poorly written, and so, no council official would ever write like that in a million years. So why they even entertained the idea is beyond me. But equally, it kind of makes sense that they have to investigate everything, don't they? They have to be seen to be doing, moving through the official channels, so to speak. So I guess they had no choice. But it's absolutely ludicrous that Zahid thought that they would take this letter seriously. Absolutely crazy. This whole incident, though, was really, really distressing for Dawn because obviously she's being investigated this whole time. It's not very nice for her, and it kind of illustrates the extreme lengths that Zahid was prepared to take in order to manipulate people into getting his way. And ultimately, his constant provocations and false reports to the authorities made him a nuisance to the entire community. And the entire community came to despise this man. Is it any wonder? They literally came to despise him. He was the neighbour from hell. Now, not only was he the neighbour from hell, he was also the leader from hell, because don't forget, he is manipulating and controlling this group of individuals. So between 2007 and 2015, the group had kind of established itself across these two houses, and it was an almost compound-like arrangement. That's, I think, where the whole idea of this cult comes from. It's almost like a compound. And basically, just as vile as he was in the community, he was also this vile behind closed doors. There was a clear hierarchy in the group. At the top was Zahid, and followed were Kay, Myra, and Kay and Myra were kind of the eyes and the ears of the group. Then came Anne, and then came Jimmy at the bottom. And bless Jimmy, he was treated the absolute worst of this group. Now, neighbours would see the group walking down the street in a line behind Zahid, and they would be kind of in this formation with Zahid at the front in his wheelchair and the others in their respective hierarchies following behind. Again, it was described as cult-like behaviour in the court. They all lived under his strict rules. They were isolated from the outside world, cut off from friends and family, and required to demonstrate loyalty to Zahid at all times. They were forced to adhere to his beliefs, and he dictated everything that they thought, everything that they did. His rules extended to every aspect of their daily lives, reinforcing their detachment from the outside world and their dependence on him. It's all about their dependence on him. It's about moving them and isolating them away from outside influences and being dependent on him. He used manipulation, he used isolation, and he used intimidation tactics. And by isolating them, they were isolated from anyone that could try to challenge Zahid's authority, that could influence them in any way from challenging him. It wasn't just psychological manipulation, he was physically assaulting them as well. He became angry over the smallest things. He'd get out of his wheelchair to hit them. He hit them with a hammer. He would hold a knife to their throats. He tried to strangle Myra a couple of times, sat on her until she lost consciousness from, being unable to breathe. He would constantly demand sex from Kay and Myra. He had these fetishes, which it's fine to have fetishes if the other people are into it too, but he would force them to do things that they didn't want to do, like drinking his urine. Lovely. He was into bestiality. And he asked the women to have sex with his dogs, which they refused to do. Good on them for refusing. But this is the kind of stuff that he liked. Later, when Zahid was arrested, the police actually recovered a number of videos showing women having sex with animals on his computer. And it kind of makes a bit of a mockery of that incident before with the dog, where he said he loved dogs so much, but he was trying to get these women to have sex with his dogs. However, the abuse within the group, it was not carried out only by Zahid. So these once vulnerable individuals that he had drawn into his group, they were now so under his control, so isolated from society and trapped in this cycle of dependency and fear, that they complied with his demands and they participated in the mistreatment of each other. And tragically, the worst treatment, the absolute worst, was reserved for Jimmy, who was at the bottom of this group's hierarchy. So there is a trigger warning from here on in. The torture of Jimmy Prout. It's horrendous. He was subjected to severe physical and psychological abuse by all 4 members of the group. The abuse began gradually, as it often does, and it began with Jimmy being forced to do all the menial tasks around the 2 homes, around the 2 properties. Things like cooking and cleaning, maintenance work, things like that, small things. But if they weren't done to a certain standard, he would be beaten. Now in 2015, this is where there was a real turning point in the level of abuse towards Jimmy. Things really did turn drastically worse. Basically, Anne's brother, Ivan, he came to stay with them at number 75. Now, Zahid strongly disliked Ivan. And this is probably because Zahid could not manipulate and control Ivan. Ivan wasn't part of this group. So he couldn't be manipulated like the others could. So Zahid disliked him. Now one day, Zahid's tools mysteriously disappeared. It's not known exactly who took the tools. Nobody knows who took them. But Zahid suspected that it was Ivan. But the problem was, Ivan wasn't part of this group. Ivan couldn't be controlled. Ivan couldn't be manipulated. Zahid could not carry out his anger on Ivan. So instead, he carried it out on Jimmy. So Jimmy was already being beaten black and blue by the group on an almost daily basis. Zahid would even instruct the others to beat Jimmy. Like, Zahid would literally sit in his wheelchair and direct instructions at the others as to what to do, and he would just sit and watch from his wheelchair. This abuse had gone on for weeks and went on for weeks, and it became increasingly more and more sadistic. So he purchased various new tools just so he could beat Jimmy with these tools, things like a rubber mallet. Jimmy was forced to stand for hours. He wasn't allowed to sit down. The group would smash bottles over his head. They would take turns strangling him and stand on him until he couldn't breathe anymore. Jimmy's food was also restricted. Now, this caused him to lose a significant amount of weight. It left him frail and weak. Now, the problem is, by depriving Jimmy of food, not only was he malnourished and hungry, but his body, it needed to be able to repair itself after all these beatings that he was getting, after the abuse that he was getting. And depriving him of food deprived his body of the ability to heal itself. The final few months of Jimmy's life literally were hell. Zahid forced Jimmy to engage in sexual acts with his dogs. Again, Zahid's a great dog lover. Zahid used pliers to remove Jimmy's teeth one by one. Zahid would even use a hammer and a chisel to smash any teeth that he couldn't remove with the pliers. Any of the teeth that he couldn't pull out, he would just smash them out. Jimmy endured this agonizing ordeal without any pain relief, and he was literally screaming in agony the whole time. In another disturbing instant, Zahid announced to the group, I don't even want to say this one, it's horrific. It's really Zahid announced to the group that he wanted to remove one of Jimmy's testicles. He asked Jimmy which testicle he would want removed. I mean, we're talking, obviously there's physical abuse, but absolute psychological horror going on here. Imagine being asked which testicle you want removing. He then hands a Stanley knife to Anne. So he's pulling Anne into this abuse, and he instructs her to cut off one of Jimmy's testicles. Now, Anne refused. So Zahid, he proceeded to take the knife and do it himself. He literally sliced open Jimmy's scrotum and removed one of his testicles. And again, oh God, this is absolutely disgusting. This is absolute sheer horror. But poor Jimmy, he is screaming in agony. He has no pain relief. He's weak. He's feeble. He can't fight back. How can he fight back? He's malnourished. And he's psychologically exhausted by this point. Zahid's sadistic acts, they don't even end there. They don't end there. He takes the severed testicle to the kitchen. He boils it in water. He returns to the living room, and then he forces Jimmy to eat it. Jimmy's broken. He is completely broken, and he complied with Zahid's demands. Despite the horror, despite the pain, despite the agony, he complied because he is physically, psychologically, mentally, absolutely exhausted. He is at breaking point. But it continues because Zahid then heats a metal bolt on the gas stove and pressed it into the wound to cauterize it before he instructs Anne to basically sew it up. A totally amateur procedure, which was repeated. It was repeated several times after the stitches burst. Anne testified in court that Jimmy was absolutely screaming in agony throughout this entire procedure. I'm not surprised. I can't even begin to imagine the absolute agony that Jimmy must have been in. Is beyond comprehension. It's beyond anything. Now, during this entire ordeal, the women stood by and did not intervene. In fact, they found Jimmy eating his own testicle quite hilarious. Quite hilarious. And they were laughing at him and asking him how it tasted. Really? And this is why I have zero sympathy about the control over these women that participated, because they are willingly participating. Like, I know they're under Zahid's manipulation, but honestly, there's enough of them to do something, to group together and go, enough is enough. And what's Zahid going to do if they all just walk out at this point? I mean, they were controlled. Zahid was manipulative, without doubt. Coercive control was going on here. But I still cannot find anything in me to be slightly sympathetic towards these women. Now, in court, they did testify how scared they were of Zahid. I mean, yeah, that's probably true. They were scared of him. But their inaction is something else. Their inaction is shocking. They would have had numerous opportunities to get help. Now, don't forget that Zahid recorded everything. There is CCTV footage of Jimmy's harrowing final days, and it shows the complicity of these women. There is footage of Jimmy being dragged along the streets. Jimmy is looking frail, he's looking weak, he's stumbling around, struggling to walk properly. In fact, Kay worked as a carer. She was a bloody carer. She would go into people's homes and help them manage their daily lives. She would take care of them, help them with their medication, help them get out of bed, help them do whatever. That's what she was trained to do, to care for others. But she stood by and did nothing as Jimmy was horrifically tortured. She did nothing. Now, people in the community, they were also witnessing incidents involving Jimmy. They were suspicious. One neighbour said that in late January 2016, she left her home very, very early in the morning. It was about 7:30 in the morning. And she found Jimmy sitting on the ground, leaning against her gate. Now, it was bitterly cold outside and the pavement was kind of covered in frost. You know, that's how cold it was. Now, Jimmy was just wearing a sleeveless jacket and he was bare under that with no top, no shoes. She said that his eyes were sunken, he looked ill, he was thin. He was covered in bruises all over his body, all over his arms and his face. She said that he was disorientated and saying, "Help us." Jimmy was saying, "Help us." Now, this neighbour, she did try and help him. She did try, but he didn't want her to ring anyone. He was terrified. He was terrified of Zahid. He was terrified of the group. And even though he was saying, "Help us," he was too terrified for anyone to actually help him. Another neighbour said Jimmy nearly fell on top of his railings. The neighbour said Jimmy looked extremely weak, as if he was sick, and that he looked white and pale and unsteady on his feet. Now, Jimmy literally almost fell on top of these railings to the point where he could have impaled himself. Luckily, he managed to kind of stop himself totally falling on these railings and kind of grab them as he fell. But he could have impaled himself. That's how weak that he was. Another time, another neighbour, he noticed that Jimmy had a black eye and he had cuts and bruises all over him. And the neighbour did inquire if he had been in a fight. Now, Jimmy lowered his head. He was too afraid to speak because the group were there. Zahid intervened and explained that Jimmy had been assaulted by a group of men who had jumped out of a car wielding a baseball bat, and basically bullshitted this neighbour. And Jimmy just kept his head down the whole time, terrified, too terrified to tell the truth. And again, another witness, she was actually shown photos of Jimmy's injuries. They were on a bus, and the group were bragging about what they had done. And they were showing this woman photos on their phone of what they had done to him. It was as if they were kind of proud somehow of what they had done. Now, this witness claimed that Myra was laughing as she was showing the pictures to her. This is so sad. This is so tragic. It's horrific. All these people in the community could see that something was going on and nobody did anything. Years ago, when I studied psychology, we did look at something called bystander theory, where basically individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim in the presence of other people, because everyone sort of thinks that other people are going to do something, and in the end, nobody actually ends up doing anything. And I think this was what was happening in this case. The most shocking aspect of this, though, is that Jimmy went to hospital 3 times. 3 times. He went in 2 weeks, 3 times, various injuries, and no one recognised the signs of abuse. Now, you can understand in the community, people know what's going on. I mean, I'm not making excuses for people, but equally, I'm understanding that it's very easy to kind of think it's not as bad as what it looks like, or there's a reasonable explanation, or somebody else is going to do something or has done something, or whatever. It's kind of human nature to kind of think these things. But when somebody is being taken to hospital and you have professionals who are trained to recognize these things, that's something else. On November the 27th, 2015, Jimmy actually sought treatment at A&E. The doctor observed that Jimmy had bruises to his face, his head, including bruises under his left eye, 2 wounds to his nose, abrasions and wounds to his forehead, bruising to the inside of his lip, bruising to the right side of his face and ear, scratch marks to his neck. He had extensive bruising to his left shoulder, bruising to his right shoulder. He had bruises and deep scratches on his arms. He had a wound to his finger. He had abrasions and bruising to his back. He had an abrasion to the back of his neck. He had stab wounds to his left shoulder, to his left upper arm. And there was a triangular, I don't know what causes a triangular stab wound, but he had a triangular stab wound to his scrotum. Now, this was nothing to do with the incident that I've already told you about. This was another incident. He also had a serious fracture to his left shoulder. And the doctor claimed that it was this fracture that was the main complaint. His injuries were so extensive, so bad, the doctor thought Jimmy had been hit with something hard or fallen from a great height. Now, Jimmy lied and said that he'd been assaulted, basically gave the same story, I believe, that Zahid had said, that he'd been hit by this group of individuals who got out of a car. Now, the doctor did call the police out. And again, Jimmy told the police officer that attended that he'd been attacked by these people with the baseball bats. Now, all through this, of course, Zahid and the others are there, watching. Jimmy is too scared to say anything because the others are there. He can't say anything. And basically, the police and the doctors and whatever, they were getting these contradictory stories about what had happened to Jimmy. And so no further action was taken. Now, on November the 30th, which was a few days after the hospital visit, Jimmy posted photographs of his injuries to Facebook, with captions like, "My body hurt, my shoulder hurts, my cheek hurts, my tooth hurts." So he kind of was reaching out on Facebook for help. He kind of was. It was like he was scared to get help, but he was in his own way reaching out. Tragically, nobody so much as even interacted with Jimmy, let alone helped him. The only interaction he had was from Anne, who liked one of his posts. She liked his post. "I'm in pain, I'm being abused, everything hurts," and somebody likes the post. Now, Jimmy attended additional medical appointments at the hospital or with a GP, but he was always accompanied by the bloody group. He was always accompanied. The doctors didn't attempt to speak to Jimmy privately. and he was too afraid to speak up on his own. And this is what you see. This is what you see. Perpetrators of domestic abuse often insist on attending appointments in order to continue maintaining that control over their victims. And that's why it's considered best practice to speak with individuals alone. The doctors know that this is best practice, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen in Jimmy's case. The group even told the doctor that Jimmy had removed his own teeth. Even if he believed that Jimmy had removed his own teeth, surely that in itself would have warranted some form of mental health support. Because you don't go around removing your own teeth for no reason. There is clearly something mentally not right. So Jimmy should have got some support. That's even if that's what they believed. Now, a domestic homicide review was conducted after Jimmy's murder. And incredibly, this review determined the authorities had 17 separate opportunities to save him. 17 opportunities, missed opportunities to save Jimmy Prout. So the final days of Jimmy Prout's life, they were hell. They were marked by relentless torture, neglect. He was severely malnourished. He was showing clear evidence of prolonged abuse. Zahid, the others in the group, they displayed zero remorse. They ignored his suffering until finally, on February the 9th, 2016, Jimmy's pain became so unbearable that he was lying awake, screaming in agony. Now, Myra and Anne, don't forget he shares this house, number 75, with Myra and Anne. They were trying to sleep, but Jimmy's screaming, it was annoying them, it was angering them because they were trying to sleep. At 5:02 a.m, Myra sent a text to Zahid saying, "This bastard had me up all fucking night. Oh, you poor lamb. You poor thing. You've inflicted all this torture and now you're annoyed because he's screaming in pain and you can't sleep." In response, Zahid and Kay went to number 75 to confront Jimmy. When they arrived, the group gathered to figure out how to silence him. Here's a thought. Take him to hospital and get him some proper pain relief and get him some treatment. Just an idea. But no. Zahid instructed Anne to take a pair of trousers and use them to gag Jimmy by tying them around his face, covering his mouth. So Anne does this, and these trousers did stifle his screams because his mouth was covered. The group left satisfied because he was now being quiet. They then went back to bed. Tragically, Anne had also covered Jimmy's nose, which prevented him from breathing. And about an hour later, when they checked on him, they found that he wasn't breathing. He didn't have a pulse. Jimmy Prout had died. He was 45 years old. Now, within just 30 minutes of discovering Jimmy's lifeless body, the group were they were together, hatching plans on how to get out of this, how to dispose of Jimmy's body. Kay went to number 35 and collected a spare wheelchair. Jimmy's body was then wrapped inside 2 sleeping bags before being placed on this wheelchair. His body was then wheeled to a nearby wasteland about 100 metres away from the house. The group basically believed that if Jimmy's body was found, it would be assumed, because of his history of homelessness, that he had died from hypothermia or something related, some other natural cause that tragically does happen when you sleep on the streets. I mean, did they not think that people might notice the bruises and the battering and all that he had? But anyway, that was their mindset. So they disposed of his body and then returned to number 35 and burned any evidence that could link them to the crimes. They then returned to their normal routines, as you do. They tried to act innocent. Now, Zahid is good at this, obviously. He is good at lying his way through situations. They basically went through the community pretending to search for Jimmy. They were asking people in the neighbourhood if anyone had seen him. They were basically making out that Jimmy had kind of disappeared and that they were all concerned and all looking for him and worried about his welfare. Like I say, it was nothing to Zahid. He was effortlessly able to lie his way through the situation. In fact, weeks went by, and the group truly believed that they had got away with this. They thought they got away with murder because the weeks ticked on and they were looking all concerned and worried about Jimmy's welfare. And they were so convinced that they had got away with his murder that later on, Zahid instructed Kay and Anne to return to Jimmy's corpse and retrieve his bank card. Now, bank records and CCTV footage reveal the group withdrawing cash from various ATMs on days that correspond to when Jimmy would receive his benefits payments. This group is disgusting. So they murder him, and now they're so convinced that they've got away with it that they're now thieving from him. 6 weeks actually went by, and the group almost did get away with it. In the end, it was their own actions that led to their downfall. Now, Anne, I believe, was beginning to have a bit of a wobble, and Zahid thought that Anne was on the verge of going to the police. So what he did was he forged a 3-page confession letter, and he signed it with Anne's name. Now, he was hoping to shift the blame onto her. I mean, he's good at false letters, right? We've seen his false letters. It's something he does. So he's basically done this confession letter so that if the police do come knocking, it'll look like Anne has confessed to everything in this letter. Now, Anne goes on the run, and on March the 25th, Zahid actually called the police and reported Jimmy missing. And what Zahid also does, he also claimed to be in danger. He told the police that Anne had murdered Jimmy and was now trying to kill him as well. Now, it's been 6 weeks, so obviously the police are suspicious, because why is it taking him so long to report Jimmy missing? He obviously wasn't that concerned. And the police, basically, they could see through the bullcrap. They could see. I mean, the police kind of knew Zahid anyway because of all the other interactions that had gone on over the years. So the police were familiar with Zahid, and they could see through the crap. They arrested Zahid, Myra, and Kay, and eventually the police did track down Anne as well. So all 4 members of the group were taken into custody. During the interrogations, surprise, surprise, the group members turn on each other. There is zero loyalty in this group, zero loyalty. They are all just dobbing each other in. And finally, it was Anne that confessed the truth about what had happened to Jimmy and where the police could find the body. So on the afternoon of March the 27th, 2016, which was actually Easter Sunday, the police discovered Jimmy's body on this wasteland near St Stephen's Way, near the house. The green colour of the outer sleeping bag had basically camouflaged Jimmy's body in the trees and the bushes. So for the 6 weeks, he was camouflaged. His body was badly decomposed and had also been partially eaten by wildlife. So a cause of death couldn't be determined. But I mean, there was evidence of extreme torture, extreme abuse. It was pretty obvious that he had endured extreme suffering. His teeth had been removed, broken, smashed. His testicle had been removed. His body was covered in stab marks, bruising. He had a tattoo on the back of his neck. They had scratched his tattoo out. This poor man went through absolute suffering and agony. The police also found Jimmy's social media posts, the ones pleading for help. And then there was all this CCTV footage as well, showing Jimmy being dragged around by the group. I mean, Zahid really did, you know, he created his own downfall in the end. So ironically, thank God for all that CCTV footage. So a year later, in May 2017, a 6-week trial began. Now, the group, of course, they all denied causing or allowing the death of a vulnerable adult between November the 1st, 2015 and March the 26th, 2016. But they all pleaded guilty to committing acts intended to pervert the course of justice between February the 5th, 2016 and March the 26th, 2016. In other words, it doesn't make any bloody sense. So they were denying murdering Jimmy or causing any torture or suffering to Jimmy, but they admitted to perverting the course of justice. So they admitted to hiding, covering, and lying about his body. How does that even make sense? It's like, if you didn't kill him, then why would you be covering up where his body is? Of course, Zahid attempted to portray himself as this innocent, honest, vulnerable man who had to use a wheelchair after a life-changing incident. However, even though Zahid was trying to convince everyone he was this vulnerable and innocent, sweet man, obviously Kay, Myra, Anne, all of them, they all testified to his manipulation, his control, his abusive character, and they all provided harrowing details about the torture that was carried out on Jimmy, or that he ordered them to carry out on Jimmy. And this is where the prosecution kind of said that this violence belonged in the Dark Ages. I mean, it's right. Pulling out people's teeth, cutting off people's testicles, it is all Dark Ages style torture. And the prosecution did try and say that the others would not have carried out this torture if it wasn't for Zahid's influence, which is kind of true. It was his influence that led to all this happening. But ultimately, I think, like I've already said, of course they were controlled to hell, but they could have done something and they chose not to. They were even laughing, for God's sake. I have zero sympathy because they were laughing at it. It wouldn't take much for these 3 women to overpower Zahid and get out of there and to take Jimmy with them. They could have done something. So I have zero sympathy with these people, as much as I have sympathy over anybody that is coercively controlled. I do not have sympathy with these women at all. They could have done something. They could have prevented this. So the court delivered the following verdicts. Anne Corbett, who was 26, was found guilty of murder and received a minimum sentence of 27 years. The court recognised her direct involvement in the murder and her participation in the torture and her role in covering up everything. Now, there is obviously some debate around this because some people argue it should have been manslaughter because obviously she didn't intend to kill Jimmy. She was covering his mouth, not his nose. It wasn't intentional. I say screw that. I'm glad it was murder and not manslaughter, because she covered everything up. She knew what was going on. She knew the consequences of everything she was doing. I'm a little bit sympathetic because obviously there is some learning difficulties there, but still, she was complicit in this. But I respect anyone who says it should be manslaughter because technically, possibly it should be. Now, Zahid. Zahid was 43 and he was convicted of murder and he received a minimum sentence of 33 years. The judge highlighted Zahid's role as the evil mastermind, noted his abuse of power and manipulation, and emphasised his total lack of remorse. Yeah, good riddance. Throw away the key. Kay Rayworth, who was 56, and Myra Wood, who was 45, they were both acquitted of murder, but they were found guilty of causing or allowing the murder of a vulnerable adult. Each received a sentence of 9 years and 8 months. Now, their sentences reflected their responsibility in allowing Jimmy's death, their failure to prevent the abuse, and their role in maintaining the group's deception. Throughout all this, people in the public gallery shouted, "I hope you fucking rot in hell," as the group were led away to start their sentences. Damn right, rot in hell. So I think I mentioned that there was this domestic homicide review that was conducted after Jimmy's death, and it identified 17 missed opportunities to intervene and potentially save him. Now, this review was actually a good thing to be carried out because what basically happened was that all these kind of services, they don't talk to each other. So people kind of knew what was going on, but nobody was talking to each other. The police, the hospitals, whatever, the council, all these services had like little snippets, little jigsaw pieces, but nobody had the entire puzzle. And so this report, it basically highlighted all these failures from all these agencies, but at least now they're taking all the appropriate steps to get these services working together and to recognise when there are issues so that things like what happened to Jimmy don't happen again. Now, obviously, the authorities, the official services, they should have stepped in somewhere and done something. But it was happening in communities. People could see, the neighbourhood could see what was going on. Now, I don't want to put blame on anybody, but I do want to leave people with a final thought that was actually said by Paul Hansom, who was the chief executive of North Tyneside Council. He said, "Please, if you see something, say something." And that really kind of sums up everything, you know, if you see something, say something. So often in life, we are too afraid or too embarrassed to say something. We think somebody else is going to do something, you know, or like I think I mentioned with the David Fuller case, there are so many stresses and demands on the services that you don't want to make a nuisance of yourself in case you're wrong. It doesn't matter if you're wrong. If you see something, say something. That's it. Side note, apparently Myra Wood is friends with Rose West in prison. She's basically jumped from one manipulator to another manipulator. There you go. Anyway, that's everything on Jimmy Prout. Bloody awful story, bloody horrendous story, another terrible one for you. I'm so sorry. I keep giving you these really, really horrible stories. Like I always say, look after yourselves though, okay? Mental health is like my number one thing. And you know, after a case like this, go and do what you have to go and do to just get yourself level again. Go and ground yourself, go and hug a tree. I love hugging trees. I've said before, my motto is going to be hug a tree. You know, what I tend to do is I tend to do these cases and then I take the dog out and I literally go and hug a tree, go and spend time with nature. It's just what I do afterwards. It just really helps to kind of just, you know, get myself back on a even keel. So yeah, you look after yourselves and hopefully see you back here again for another case at my true criminal abode. Bye.